Welcome back to another Sportsnaut interview. College football week 1 kicks off this weekend, highlighted by number 1 Georgia taking on number 14 Clemson. And joining us is a man who knows Georgia football very well. Mark Weiszer is our guest, and Mark covers Georgia football for the Athens Banner-Herald. And Mark, I know this is a big week for you and Georgia football. We appreciate you making some time for us today.
Yeah, no problem. Good to be with you.
Now, before we get into the matchup with Clemson, I do want to get into some big picture topics with you surrounding the program of Georgia. I know it was a tough offseason for the football team, as well as Kirby Smart. There was a number of off-the-field incidents involving traffic incidents, speeding. I believe there was a DUI in there, all kinds of things, a plethora of issues. So I'm going to cut right to the chase here with this one. Do you feel that Kirby Smart has failed to get a handle on his players and their off the field behaviors? And what are supporters of the program saying in and around Athens, Georgia?
I don't know if I want to say that he's failed. I mean, he's the head football coach for Georgia. There's 120 guys on the roster. I don't want to put it all on him. Obviously, he's the leader of the program. Can Georgia do a better job of keeping their guys from, having these kind of speeding incidents? Certainly they can. And I think that's a team effort for the support staff, the administration, to get the message through to the program. I mean, Kirby's making $13 million, so I guess the buck stops with him. But this seems like it's an off-season issue. Now we're really kind of into the season. Kirby and his coaching staff have more control over their players, since preseason camp began. But certainly, since the tragic death of offensive lineman Devin Willock and recruiting staffer Chandler LaCroix back in January of 2023, Georgia's still had a lot of issues with players, being charged with reckless driving, with speeding, with racing. And, some of that will bleed into the season. We'll find out whether there's a couple players suspended. Kirby's not one to go ahead and announce that stuff ahead of time.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. We'll move to the more on the field topics now. They won the back-to-back championships a couple of years ago, and they were well on their way last year until they came up short in the SEC championship game versus Alabama, which, eventually derailed their hopes of a third consecutive title, did not make the college football playoff. What has been the message throughout the offseason? What is Kirby Smart preaching the mindset to be following what ultimately is a disappointing season for Georgia football as they move in towards, this coming season?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really sense that it's, the driving motivation. I mean, it is for certain players. I think Carson Beck in particular, because he wants to win a national championship, being the guy at quarterback. Obviously it was Stetson Bennett that did it in back-to-back years. But Georgia does a good job of kind of, resetting, rebooting. I don't think anyone thought that Georgia was going to go, undefeated necessarily. Once again, I mean, in many years, this would have been a playoff team last year, but you had Georgia, you had Florida State left out, probably worthy of being in the playoff. At least publicly, Kirby's kind of framed it that way. That's not a huge motivation. Now, behind closed doors, he does anything he can to kind of light a fire. So maybe that is something that he'll be talking about, the fact that you weren't one of the best teams last year, and now you have a chance again.
During those championship runs that we saw Georgia have recently, the identity of the football team was their defense. But this year's team is headlined by Carson Beck, the quarterback, and who is a Heisman hopeful, I might add. But he's going to have to do it this year without 4 of his top 5 receiving options from last year. So give us the names of some of these players who are going to have to step up and try to fill the void with some of that production that was left.
Yeah, I mean, let's start at tight end. When you lose Brock Bowers, who was kind of a once-in-a-generation type tight end who, they line him up at running back on occasion, obviously, wide and could make great plays in the open field. Oscar Delp is kind of the next guy at that position, but they brought in Ben Yurcek as well from Stanford, a veteran who's been around for several years, productive college player that dealt with some injuries. So he has a chance to kind of maybe be the 1-2 punch there. Dylan Bell's the guy that's kind of been, they've used him at obviously a wide receiver where he kind of has done his thing, but they also were shorthanded at running back to start last season. And he's a guy that they got the ball in his hands. He can make plays for them. You're going to see, Trevor Etienne, the transfer from Florida, is going to, come in and be the kind of the workhorse back I would expect. But there's other guys behind him. But Branson Robinson comes back from an Achilles injury that kept him out all of last season. There's a freshman that came in from California that I would expect also a 4 or 5 star guy. So they have talent that Arian Smith is a guy that's going to be interesting. Track guy, made a lot of big plays at Georgia, but hasn't made them as often as they would like. Has had some problems with drops, had a bunch of injuries. So it'll be interesting to see the characters that emerge. The big playmakers. Don Lovett, was kind of a big play guy last year, or at least racked up 50 plus catches. Can he kind of emerge as the next guy to be a go-to guy like Ladd McConkey was?
Yeah, so although they've lost some pretty talented players from last year's team, this is Georgia football we're talking about, and Georgia doesn't, they just retool, they reload, and it doesn't sound like the cupboards are very bare right now for Georgia football. Still plenty of weapons there for Carson Beck. Now, we've seen a number of players from the Georgia defense in recent years get drafted. And I know that this year they have a safety, Malachi Starks, I believe his name is, who could be one of the top safeties to hear his name called in the 2025 draft. But based on how this year's team is built, where is the strength in this team?
I think it's, you mentioned Starks. I think it's some individual playmakers. Linebacker, they bring back Smile London, who's one of those guys that had an off-field incident, a reckless driving, a racing incident that got kind of pled out in the court, and the case was resolved, but he could be suspended for the Clemson game. Kirby Smart hasn't said that, but he's a guy that's been kind of an important piece at inside linebacker. CJ Allen's another guy at linebacker that really emerged last year. They had some injuries there. Jamon Dumas Johnson, who has since transferred to Kentucky, his injury kind of forced CJ Allen to play, early last year. And then a guy like Michael Williams, one of the NFL mock draft guys from ESPN had him as a projected number 1 overall pick. Maybe like Trayvon Walker, a guy that can come off the edge, can line up at defensive end or outside linebacker, and really is kind of scratching the surface. I think this could be the year that he will be unleashed and really, be the next guy of Georgia's front seven guys that look like big things for the NFL.
So plenty of playmakers. Okay. Noted. Now let's move into the matchup with Clemson. Now you look at this matchup on paper, you see the rankings, you see number 1 Georgia, 14 Clemson. You're thinking this is going to be a really, really good game here, but Vegas odds makers, they see it a little different. They have Georgia as the 14-point favorites right now. One of the storylines that I've been reading about going into this game for Georgia is the situation at running back. So what is the latest that you can tell us on who's going to be out there, who's going to be available, and who we can expect to see?
Trevor Etienne is probably going to be suspended if I had to guess. He had a DUI that ended up being dismissed, that charge, but he had several other misdemeanor charges, driving violations that I think he was going 30-ish miles over the speed limit, and told police that he had a few beers earlier in the evening. But so I think Kirby's probably going to suspend him, but he's not saying that yet. As I mentioned earlier, I think you're going to see Branson Robinson as kind of the main guy at running back, and they might have to rely on a walk-on, even Cash Jones, because Roderick Robinson, another experienced back that they have, has a toe injury, underwent surgery. This is a Georgia team last year that was more reliant on Carson Beck's arm and the weapons on the outside and those tight ends. So I think they will be able to run the ball still. They have one of the best offensive lines in college football, but it might be a game where you do the quick swing passes, get the ball into the playmakers' hands, or they can even put Dylan Bell again at running back on a couple of occasions, do some end arounds for Arian Smith, get the ball in his hand at wide receiver. So I think at running back in particular, that's the one area that Georgia could be very thin for this game.
What has to go right for Clemson in order to pull the upset here and beat this Georgia team? What's the weakness that Dabo Swinney should look to attack on this Georgia football team?
I mean, if they can get the running game going, Georgia's defensive line, what was kind of the weak point against Alabama. So if Clemson can do that, if Cade Klubnik, can make some more explosive plays with these wide receivers, they don't have the type of wide receivers of Clemson that they had, back in their heyday of their playoff run. And if they can avoid the miscues, the tackles for losses, the fumbles in the red zone. I think that's what Clemson needs to do to be able to stay with Georgia. But that defensive line in particular, the secondary, we're not sure about. I mean, they do have Starks, as we mentioned earlier, but they lost 3 NFL draft picks from their secondary. So, can Clemson exploit the inexperience there? Guys that haven't, gotten, the full complement of snaps on the back end, we'll see.
I'm not sure if you've had a chance to do it yet, but I'm going to ask you anyhow. Do you have a game prediction for this weekend for us?
I think I had it Georgia 31, Clemson 14. I mean, Georgia hasn't lost a regular season game since 2020. Clemson obviously is coming off a year where they went 4-4 in the ACC. And, I need to see it from Clemson that they're, have taken a step up, that, that this offense can be, as we mentioned earlier, a little bit more explosive. And, this offensive coordinator for Clemson was a TCU offensive coordinator for the national championship game a couple of years ago, and Georgia snuffed them out. So I think Clemson's more talented on offense. We'll see, what that looks like this time around. But it's hard to pick, Georgia to win this one close. I think they get a pretty comfortable win.
Big season ahead for Georgia football. It all gets started here this weekend on Saturday versus number 14 Clemson at noon from Atlanta. Should feel like a home game for the Bulldogs. Mark Weiszer, we appreciate you for joining us, and we appreciate all your insight. Thanks for your time today.
Yeah, good to be with you.